Okay, so in the next 12 slides or so, we're going to be looking together at the top tips for writing questions in questionnaires. So to give an overview of this session, I'm going to have just a quick thought about how we get started with generating questions. I want to share with you some tips for writing questions and responses. There'll be a little sort of breakout moment where you might want to carry out an activity that I've suggested. Then we'll move on to talking about testing questions and the possibility that you might have potential to pilot your questionnaire more extensively before you start. We'll talk about what I mean there by optional. And then I'll just give you a sort of brief overview of the terms validity and reliability and how they're relevant here and how I put this questionnaire work in a wider context. So to get started, I always say this to people when we run our one-day course on questionnaire design, that it's quite easy to lose sight of the big question you're trying to answer with your questionnaire. So I just encourage you to go back to basics again and really consider what is the overarching question you're seeking to answer through your questionnaire, because that's where you need to start to generate the questions that will make up your questionnaire tool. So we want to look at that big question and really break it down into the individual questions you want to ask. So it's a good idea to just sort of do some free thinking about initially what your questions might be, starting from that big question. So I think this is just another good thing to be aware of as you get started with writing questions, which is to recognise there are different types of questions and that some are slightly more sensitive to wording than others. So the sort of 5 different types are shown here, and the ones at the bottom there, the sort of more fact-based questions, knowledge and attributes, where we might be asking people something about themselves, some characteristic, or we might be asking people perhaps what they know about a certain topic. Those are more fact-based and slightly easier to write or slightly less sensitive to the wording. But as we go up that list of items, so to asking people more about their personal experience or behaviour or attitudes, that wording becomes quite important. So it's worth just recognising what kinds of questions you're writing and how you need to pay attention to the wording to really make those questions as strong as possible. I confess to having found it quite challenging to write sort of just so few slides on top tips for writing questions. There's so much we could share with you in terms of these tips, but it's also quite good to have had that discipline to really hone this down to the most useful list of tips for writing questions. And I hope you find this useful. Probably don't need to explain all of them, but we'll just run through it fairly quickly. But you might want to keep this to hand when you actually get to the point of writing your questions. So utterly basic, but we can all fall into this. Write in as simple language as you can and avoid those jargons and abbreviations that we all use so readily, particularly in health. So try and keep those out. It is quite easy, as I say, just to fall into that by accident. And I've had many people show me questionnaires where they've not spotted that tendency to use language that we're familiar with, but we haven't necessarily thought about whether our audience is familiar with it. Also, keeping questions as short as possible. Again, or sounds obvious, and we think we know those sorts of things, but it's very easy to not recognise perhaps the way we've put something is more complicated than it needs to be. I've suggested you be cautious about asking hypothetical questions. However, I do know there is a place sometimes for those. So, those are the questions where we're asking people to sort of think as if something were happening. If you were going to change your transport to work, what might you choose? Those sorts of things. So sometimes we want to ask hypothetical questions, that's okay, but keep those to a minimum. We ask a lot of questions often about asking people to go back in time and recall an experience and a period of time. And I just encourage you to keep those questions realistic in terms of not putting too much burden on people's memory. And again, with certain groups of respondents, that may be particularly important. So just keep it realistic about how far back we can really expect people to recall accurately. And again, come back to that point I made just now about the big question you're asking and really test yourself on whether every question is relevant. So sometimes we kind of sneak questions in because they're nice to have, things we might be interested in, which are slightly more tangential to our topic. but won't ultimately help you with your project aims. So really consider, is every question relevant? Because the longer the questionnaire, the more likely it is to end up in the bin, and that's just the real truth. We all know that. You can, if a questionnaire just keeps going, you get to the point and think, I've had enough and I'm, quitting at this point. So do think about length. Again, familiar bit of advice. I'm sure we've seen it before, but it's quite easy to phrase questions in a way which actually leads people towards a certain type of answer. So just be wary of that. Be aware that's something that might slip into the phrasing of questions, and try and keep things as neutral as possible. A couple of very simple tips there about avoiding double-barreled questions where you've got an and or an or in the middle, where it's quite hard to give one answer that relates to both things. So we want to avoid that. And also that increases the amount of effort required on the part of the respondent. So again, keeping questions simple and avoiding those double negatives, which can just be confusing and the person doesn't really know how to respond. And then lastly, as I say, this is such a rapid run through, but a good useful tip overall is to, once you've sort of collated your questions in a way that you think works, that we must just think about the order that the whole questionnaire, how it comes together as a whole sequence of questions, and consider that the logic for the person reading it, and whether you're keeping sort of questions about a certain topic or theme, keep those together so that it's not jumping about and is awkward to do and the person thinks, oh, I was thinking about that a minute ago. You want to keep it nice and fluent, which again encourages people to get to the end. And it's also just a good general tip to put some of those easier questions, which take a bit less effort to answer, so some of those fact-based questions, at the beginning, before you move on to perhaps some of the more complex things which require a bit more thinking or a bit more recall. And similarly, we want to put those questions which perhaps just a bit more sensitive or a bit more personal, putting those a little bit later in the sequence is also considered sort of good practice, and likely to mean that people by that point have sort of bought into the questionnaire and are keen to continue. So we've had a quick whistle-stop tour to writing questions, top tips for writing questions. And now I just want to share a few suggestions really about thinking about the responses are just as important as the answers, as the questions, sorry. So a good general tip is to have a mix of different question formats, because this sort of stops people getting into a slightly habitual way of answering questions and ticking boxes. But if they've actually got to just stop and go, oh, there's a different way in which I'm being asked to engage with the question, perhaps using a visual analog scale like that one shown on the slide, that sort of thing can just really sort of prompt and trigger some fresh thinking. So having a mix of those yes, no, tick list things, some Likert scales or visual analog, and a few open questions is generally considered good practice. So you probably want to minimize those because they generate much more unwieldy data. And if we want a lot of those, then possibly you should be looking at a more qualitative method. But one or two is considered a good feature of a questionnaire, because it does give people that space to tell you things in their own words, and which for some things can be quite important when we need a little bit more detail or we can't completely predict how people might reply. And it's also just polite sometimes to have that space to tell us any other comments. So this variety keeps the questionnaire interesting, and that's really important for encouraging people to complete it, and for encouraging people, just prompting them rather to have to think a bit more about what their answers are. So in general, we want to make sure responses are obviously appropriate to the question, so we can try and guess what we think are the most appropriate answers, and we won't always get that right. So we do want to sometimes provide the other category, or a don't know category, as it says there. And also we must think about, if we provide too many possible answers, that can then become frustrating because it's hard to pick just one answer. But similarly, if we don't want to give too few, that then how you're feeling, what your answer would be, isn't really reflected in that list. So there's always a balance in getting that list of responses right. And importantly, we want to make sure that our answers can only really fit one category, unless we want to offer that tick all that apply option. And an easy mistake that people can make is having answer categories that are overlapping, classically age, as we've got there. Just want to make sure that people's answer really only fits in one category, otherwise you're going to have problems later when you come to analyse. Okay. Okay, so in this at this point, I think it's good to always just have a moment to stop and reflect on some of what we've been saying here. So you might want to just pause the slides at this point and have a look at this activity about writing questions. And what I'm suggesting here is that you just look at the 5 questions there and decide what you think, what type of question it is, from looking back at that slide about the types of questions ranging from attitude, behaviour, knowledge, experience, etc. And also then just to have a look and see how you might sort of critique these suggestions and how you might come up with ideas, what your ideas might be for improving the phrasing of these questions. And this is something that we might look to follow up on in the live session that will follow the availability of these slides. So I'm probably taking just sort of 5 to 10 minutes to have a look at this and do the work, and then we will follow up with you in the live session. So once we've, again, this feels at a very fast pace that we're going, but if we look at once we've written our questions and considered the way in which we might offer different response options, it's a good point to consider how the questionnaire is starting to look. So as I said, we need to look and pay attention to the order of questions and how the tool sort of works as a whole and how fluent and sort of easy to work through that it is, but also this is a good point really to spend time on formatting and actually making it look attractive, and taking up as, not so condensed that it looks too busy and cluttered and looks like a lot of work to complete, but equally not so spaced out that we're sort of that it looks clumsy, if you know what I mean. And it's a good practice generally to make it absolutely clear who has generated the questionnaire, sort of any logos, any sort of opening statements about who this is from, and obviously all of the usual good practice about ethics, if required in your evaluation, making a clear ethics statement at the start, and any requirement to seek consent. So then the next big step is to test out those questions that you've come up with to see how they work, and I really encourage you at this point to not be too sort of wedded to those specifics of those questions you've got so far, but to be really open to some feedback about whether they work. And there's various options you can use for doing this. So you might have the opportunity, if you've got a group you're already working with, to just have a fairly informal focus group discussion about the questions. So you share the questions and you invite the group to comment on those. So it's a fairly sort of quick and ready method for getting some feedback. Or you might want to do some more detailed interviews, respondent interviews. And I'm going to share with you an idea from psychology, which we call cognitive interviewing. So this is a very particular form of interviewing, if you've got the chance, which allows you to explore how questions are interpreted and understood. And there's a quote there, a reference, if you want to look into cognitive interviewing in a bit more detail. So just to explain what that is very quickly, again, we normally have time to go into a bit more detail, but I don't think it's necessary here. We can just sort of explain a bit about the cognitive process in answering questions, which is perhaps something you might not have thought about before, but it's good just to recognise there's the different stages, and then that gives us the chance to ask questions in our cognitive interview with a potential respondent, which will help just unravel what's going on in the sort of thinking process whilst that person's looking at the questions. So the first stage in our processing of a question is literally taking the question in and comprehending it. What does it mean? What am I being asked? And then we move to a stage of actually needing to think, right, well, I understand the question. What is it that I'm being asked to recall? Can I recall that information? And how am I being asked to capture that? In terms of, am I being asked for facts or some estimate of something? And then I need to move to making a judgment. So what's my answer? I've read that, I've comprehended the question, I've recalled some information, either it might be an opinion or a viewpoint, or it might be an experience, something I'm being asked to look back on. And I need to then make a judgment about what do I think about that. So there's a sort of internal process of reaching a decision about something, and then there's an active process beyond that of actually selecting the response from those available. So there's a sort of 4-stage cognitive effort, if you like, in processing questions in a questionnaire. So I'm just going to quickly explain 2 approaches to cognitive interviewing that might be useful. The first is think aloud interviewing, which pretty much as it sounds is the interviewer sitting with the respondent as they work through the questionnaire and inviting them to think aloud during that process. So not much else is asked other than to say, tell me what you're thinking as the respondent works through the questionnaire. And this obviously was going to pick up some of the sort of thought processes and some of that cognitive effort that we talked about just now that takes place during that process. If it might be felt that it would be easier to provide, or if we feel there are quite specific details about our questionnaire that perhaps we want to ensure are working, we might use what's called verbal probing techniques in a slightly more sort of interactive or shared interview, if you like, where the interviewer actually probes specific details and words in the questionnaire and how those are being interpreted. So we might, for example, say, what does the term outpatient mean to you? Or we might inquire how an answer was reached and what recall strategy was used, which allows us to just sort of test out the accuracy of those answers. And so that process just gives us a little bit more in understanding of how all the different features of the questionnaire are being processed. And it gives us an opportunity, both these methods give us that opportunity to improve the clarity of the questions we're asking and indeed the response options, which might just relieve some of that sort of cognitive effort or cognitive burden of completing a questionnaire, and ultimately help us increase the data that's generated by the tool. Okay, as we come towards the last few slides, I just want to explain the idea of piloting your questionnaire, which is really taking the testing of your questions to the next level. You may not necessarily have time for this additional work, which is why I've indicated that it's optional, but it really does enhance the quality of your final tool if you can do it. So I encourage you to do it. But if it's not possible, it's not absolutely essential as long as you've done some pre-testing of your questions in the way that we've just been talking about. Okay, so basically this is, as I say, taking this idea to the next level, which is giving the whole draft questionnaire, which has gone through some initial testing process, to a small number of respondents who ideally are similar to your target group. And this is all we mean by a pilot. We call that a pilot study. And we give that to, as I say, a small number. There's no specified number, depends who you've got access to, and ideally we wouldn't then include those people in our subsequent sample. What we do with this is, as I say, just give it to them. We're not involved, we're not doing any interviewing in that process, just give it to them as we would normally distribute a questionnaire, and then just review the responses we get back and any feedback perhaps that we've invited about the questionnaire as part of that process. And we want to see through this process, through a pilot, if all the questions were answered, or did people sort of drop out partway through because it got too long, or they've got other reasons for doing that. And we want to see how they've used the response options, and perhaps they've indicated, they wanted other options available. We also want to check that questions have given the information we were seeking by asking them. So we want to see have the questions worked. And then we can work and revise the tool and change perhaps the wording of some questions that have been interpreted as being ambiguous in some way, or questions that just haven't worked. And we might get ideas and suggestions about how to shorten the questionnaire if we can see by doing that actually we're doubling up on some things. Ideally, if we can, we go through a second round of that just to really polish it, but often that sort of thing isn't possible. If possible, and as well, or indeed instead of, if you don't have time for a full pilot, it's just good to get as many opinions on your tool as possible, and ideally from an expert group who perhaps are connected with the study that you're doing, and ask them for feedback on whether they feel it has all the appropriate questions to really unpick this topic and help you answer your big question, as we keep saying. And the people that you consult there may just also have other useful suggestions of things you might edit or additional questions that will perhaps improve the tool or the data quality in some way. I felt it's quite difficult to sort of talk about designing a tool and piloting it and really refining it to ensure we're increasing and maximising the quality of our data without just very quickly touching on two concepts which are important in research and evaluation methodology, which are validity and reliability. And some of you may be familiar with these terms from other studying you've done or other work contexts. So as I've just been explaining, piloting can tell us how well our questionnaire works in a practical way. Can people actually complete it and give the answers they want? But sometimes we need to do a bit more and go a bit more in depth in terms of testing whether our measurement tool, whether that's a questionnaire or whether it's some sort of tool we might use in healthcare, some sort of actual physical piece of equipment. We want to find out how accurate our tool is. And we want to know these two things really. Is it really measuring what we think it's measuring? And that's the concept of validity. Is it an accurate tool for what we're trying to measure? And is it reliable? So does it measure that construct, that thing we're interested in a consistent way over different occasions or over different people administering it, whatever the variation might come from? So it's just really, these two concepts are just really helpful in just being familiar with. And it's important for us to make sure that if we haven't been able to do that formal testing, where we can perhaps do things, for example, to measure validity, we might compare how our tool works against a gold standard measure of that same thing. So the classic example is, how if we're designing a tool to measure mental well-being, we might use our tool to measure that construct, that concept, and compare the measurements with an existing sort of current best practice tool, and just measure the correlation in the data that each tool generates. And we might equally want to test its reliability in a similar way. We can compare measurements taken at different times or carried out by different people administering the tool, and do some formal measurement of agreement. But we're getting quite technical here, and it's very unlikely, I feel, generally it is unlikely in evaluation, particularly sort of smaller scale, more localized evaluations, for us to actually have the time and money to do that formal validity testing, because it's pretty much a whole study in itself. But it's just really important that we are absolutely transparent about what we've done to test our tool, and important that we're not claiming that our tool is formally validated. And if you include that in your report, that's the best that you can do. So in summary from these slides, we looked at that overarching question that we're trying to answer, and always keeping that in mind throughout the design of your tool. We looked at we talked about the importance of keeping questions simple English, as short as possible, relevant to that big question. It's good to offer that variety in our response types and the way we're asking people to process questions. We should pay attention to the order of questions as they're presented, and whether that's a fluent process, and whether we're taking people through the questions in a logical way. We want to make it look professional and attractive. And then finally, we want to have gone through some sort of process for testing out our questions, and if possible, have piloted our tool. Thank you. The next set of slides is going to be looking at actually the delivery of our questionnaire and how we go about that and what we need to think about.